I want to introduce you to our 2021 program chair, Matt Hagar, and also our today's speaker, Dr. Norman Miller. And I'm gonna let Matt introduce Dr. Norm Miller.
All right, thank you, Helen, and good morning, everybody. So this morning we have a very exciting presentation from Professor Miller, Dr. Miller. So he is the faculty at the University of San Diego, where I went to my master's program. So he has been a professor of mine. I've also heard him speak at several different presentations. He's spoken at MIPIM, NAOP, also the CCIM national conferences. He's the chair of real estate finance at the University of San Diego. He also has his PhD in real estate and finance from the Ohio State. And he is an excellent speaker. I've heard a lot of speakers over the course of my career, and he's definitely captivating, and he provides a lot of insight. And I definitely say he's one of the best. So without further ado, Professor Norm Miller, you've got the floor.
Thanks, Matt. And let me share my screen. And now you probably see email. So let me go ahead and now do you see a slide?
Yep.
All right, good. Thank you. Thanks, Matt. So I put together somewhat of an eclectic presentation. It's a small enough group that we can hit a number of topics and hopefully have some time for comments and discussion. By way of overview, before we kind of get started on the slides, Helen was talking just briefly about touching on the housing market and the economy in general, maybe more so than what I've put together. So I just wanted to mention that, you know, we're doing good on some things in the economy. We have 916,000 jobs created in March, and that's really good. On the other hand, just yesterday, we came out with an inflation number that is 7.2% annualized on the CPI. That's not good. I guess that's where the good, the bad, the ugly come in. Our 10-year treasuries, though, are still low at around 1.65, and that's a key number to look at for our future financing rates. And then at the same time, something that we can touch on more if you want, the housing market is so tight. It's tighter than it's ever been in my lifetime, and I do monitor it, that we have what's called the prisoner's dilemma going on right now, where nobody will list their home for sale because they're afraid they won't be able to find another place to buy. And so we end up with this extremely low inventory. Now in the commercial market, it's quite different. I do want to add too that I have a long-term relationship with CCIM. I worked with the Body of Knowledge Leadership Committee for about 10 years. When I moved out to California, it was a little bit hard to get to Chicago. Had we been thinking like we're thinking right now, we probably would have continued the relationship a little bit more. But, you know, back in those days, we just weren't thinking as openly. We thought we had to be together. But again, I appreciate Matt's invite. By way of overview too, I wanted you to know that I am an optimist and a pessimist at the same time. I'm very optimistic about human innovation, science, technology, helping us overcome incompetency in government and political corruption that can only deal with tough problems when there's a crisis. And of course, my pessimism comes in on the political side, obviously. But you know, science is so exciting right now, and technology and 5G coming on board is going to affect real estate. Autonomous driving is going to affect buildings and drop-off designs and cities. Batteries right now are going to be, you know, 3 or 4 times as good as they are now within a few years, and that's incredible. I can already go over 300 miles with the current car battery that I happen to have. Can you imagine if it was 1,500 miles in 5 years? It's a game changer. And then we have machine learning going on right now, and a lot of technology, robotics, vaccines, all of which help us live better. But I am a little bit pessimistic on the political side. We'll get into that a little bit more. So in honor of Matt, I wanted to show Matt and everybody how we've changed our view a little bit about the skill set and screening our master students. So I thought I'd briefly share this, given it's a small group and I sort of feel I know the CCIM audience a little bit. So this is real estate career choices explained with Venn diagrams. Just take a couple of minutes to go through this. So if you have problem solving skills, we had a few math skills, you might be good at facilities, property management, asset management. If we add to that negotiation skills, you might work as a broker. We might steer you that direction. If we had people skills, you might be good at leasing. Then if we had drinking skills, you could be a developer. If we add to that you're heartless, you might consider being a lender. If you're OCD, well, you could work in investor acquisitions, especially when there's a recession. If you tend towards verbosity, you might work as a real estate lawyer. If you combine a little bit of math with verbosity, you might work as an appraiser. And if you are verbose, heartless, you have drinking skills, and you have an opinion on everything, you might work as a consultant, media pundit, or professor. So Matt, you hadn't seen that before, but that's our new explanation on real estate career choices and steering students.
Accurate.
And I hope I didn't offend any lawyers or lenders out there, or acquisition people, but those in the industry can relate a little bit to this. So getting back to COVID, the economy, COVID-19 just accelerated everything, all these trends. And we're going to go through a little bit of that. My political pessimism versus my science optimism is partly because look at how we could have done things better. I look at New Zealand and I say, why couldn't we have been a little bit more like them? So this is New Zealand, January 6th of this year. No mask, no cases, no 6-foot gap. And the reason is because when COVID hit, they really cracked down hard. And the difference was that really quick shutdown made such a difference. So what they did is they basically shut down their borders for a little while. You had to be a legal resident to get in. They put everybody into quarantine for 2 weeks. So if you came in, they had to make sure you didn't have COVID. And here's the populations of Alabama and Louisiana versus New Zealand, roughly equal size places. And we see the number of COVID cases in New Zealand on the right side there versus typical US states of the same size. So it's kind of amazing how well this could have been managed. Of course, that would require a culture change in the United States and some notion of caring more about protecting our fellow citizens versus the notion of freedom. But this is just amazing to me how well we could have done things. Meanwhile, continuing with the political issues, CDC came out, several months ago, and they said that we have a moratorium on evictions, and they use this rationale about, creating homelessness and more cases. It seems to me that HUD is the group that should have been dealing with whether or not we should have evictions or a moratorium on evictions. But it was through March of this year. It's been extended to June. I'm sure that this really does help needy people and people that do need help, but there was no vertical integration of holding off property taxes. There was some moratorium on mortgage repayments at Fannie and Freddie, but certainly landlords had a lot of costs that continued on. And right now it's through June, and it does vary state by state. So it's a distortion of the market, no matter how you look at it. And we also learned that the government's willing to interfere in other ways, not just the CDC, but the state of California, not to be outdone. They went to June 30th before the CDC did. And then they said, as long as tenants pay 25% of their rent, that they cannot be evicted. And it doesn't matter whether this is a $5,000 a month apartment or $1,500 a month or $500 a month, they're all treated the same. So, so politically, again, I'm a pessimist in terms of solving problems. We get into crisis and we distort the markets, and we're going to continue to do that. But meanwhile, back on the economy, the stimulus has been so strong that we're actually spending more than we did in January of last year on a number of items, durable goods, and the consumer spending in the U.S. has been strong. And we're going to continue to add to the stimulus, so it's going to get even stronger. Now, keep in mind that the more stimulus we have now, the more we're pushing taxes onto our kids and grandkids. So every time I talk to any young audience, I apologize for the fact that I'm spending now what they'll have to repay later. I hear somebody talking. Maybe they can mute.
Similar looking profile of these blood clots is that in the UK they've recommended people under 30 get a different.
Terry, can you mute them?
I can respond. It's you. And I just
So California is better off than most states, facing eviction. This is the percentage of renters unable to pay rent. And you see that if you have portfolios in Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, Florida, West Virginia, they have much more of a struggle with rent than in a market like California, Oregon, or Washington. The coastal markets are a little bit better off. And part of that is correlated with education and correlated with the ability to work remotely. And so we are not seeing an even effect on the economy of the moratoriums and COVID. But at the same time, it turns out that rent payments in commercial real estate have been better than expected in most sectors. Industrial has been, on average, paying 100% of expected rent. Data centers are paying 100% of the rent. Biotech and life science paying 100% of their rent. Offices have been paying around 95%, and it's incredible considering the fact that the occupancy rates have been, 20 to 40% going up recently. But for the most part this year, we haven't been using our offices, and yet the tenants have been paying their rent. The one thing I do note to watch are the sublease rates. The sublease rates are up in most cities, but especially your larger cities, your vertical urban dense cities, San Francisco, LA, New York, Chicago, Boston. Those are the markets where we're seeing higher sublease rates, and sublease rates are always a leading indicator of future vacancy and declining rents. But in our second tier cities and our low-rise cities, the sublease rates are not up very much, and they're doing just fairly well. Of course, we'll come back to office because the question is, how much space do we need in the future? That's an important question. Residential, about 80 to 95% of the expected rents coming in, depending on the price tier. And
I don't know precisely if they have another facility.
we still have some sound in the back. Hope you can hear me. Retail, it varies by tenant. Grocers, drugstores are doing just fine. Others with hybrid strategies are thriving, and others are in trouble. I'm going to show you a little more detail on that. Hotels are a mixed bag, but generally hit hard, and movie theaters are in trouble. So we are not all hit the same way, but overall, the big picture is not bad on rent, and is being paid a little bit better than if I had surveyed the same group a year ago. You probably would have been more concerned than we needed to be.
They'll probably back online with the vaccine rollout.
Now, real estate sector appeal as an investment, it partly depends on the stock market. And the stock market's really the gambler's first choice until it corrects, and then all of a sudden risk matters again. Those of you that remember the dot-com bust of the late 1990s would remember that all of a sudden we had this increased allocation to real estate because the stock market had taken a big hit. And again, all of a sudden risk mattered. So, excuse the phone in the background. I think the same thing is going to happen again. And I wonder whether it's going to be the cryptocurrency or the prop tech bust, but there'll be some trigger. We'll have a correction, and then you're going to see increased allocations to real estate again. If you look at the fragility of the different investment sectors, and you look at the effect of the top 1% of the assets, and you see how much that they've driven returns. If you're in the stock market, that top 1%, if you weren't there, you had a below market return. It really had a big impact. So in the stock market, we could pick 5 stocks out and they would have really dominated the overall trend in the stock market. Well, in real estate, that's not the same at all. You remove the top 1%, it means nothing. So we're a much more stable asset class. Income's a much higher proportion of the returns than prices. And because of that, it's anti-fragile, it's lower risk. And those that are concerned about risk will be allocating more money to real estate in the future. But what are the implications of 1.9 trillion more and then another 2.3 trillion after that, and then maybe another 2 trillion infrastructure after that? Well, you know, add a few trillions up, it adds up to real money. It is going to help those states and local budgets, schools, unemployment benefits. It will go to those who need it, but it also will go to those who don't. Like my granddaughter, you know, she's happy to go to school, collect unemployment benefits, and not really look that hard for a job until it runs out. Recently, she asked me about helping her invest in the stock market. If that's not an indication that maybe we have oversupplied stimulus a touch, I don't know what is. But it does goose the economy. There's never been any penalty for any president of either party to say, let's spend a whole lot more than we tax and goose the economy, because it passes that debt down to the next generation. And someday we're going to hit that wall because we're going to crowd out the private market too much. And we're going to have to deal with either higher inflation or a big recession. But for now, there's no penalty. So if you look at the budget deficit, and this was done January of last year, you can see this huge number here of added deficit, and then a projected huge number here in 2021. And now we're talking about the infrastructure bill at another couple $2 trillion. And of course, that's a fair amount of money. Now, here's our entitlements. Here's where we spend it: Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. But look how big this other stuff is. Defense is pretty big right now. The net interest is only 8%, but that's because we're at these unbelievably low rates. Now, just imagine if our T-bonds were not at 1.65, but the more normal 3.5 that they're going to be at when we factor inflation in and we no longer keep the interest rates down. That interest number is going to balloon, which is going to be hard to control. And when are we going to hit the wall? That's an important question. My projection is in about 9 to 10 years, we're going to hit that wall and we're going to have to deal with that debt. So, you know, what does it mean when we borrow another 4 trillion? It's about 22,000 more per person. So just imagine over the last year, you decided to borrow an extra $22,000 and spend it on things. Stimulus, things that you support, things that you may not support. That's huge. And of course, that means that we're going to continue to see a strong economy over the next year because of the goosing of all that money into consumer spending and budgets. Eventually, we're going to have to figure out how to deal with it. And one way to deal with it is just to allow inflation. to run up, and that devalues our debt. But then interest rates soar. And of course, when they soar, that's going to put us into a recession. That will happen, but I don't see it happening anytime soon. I'd say we're going to have a good year or two. But again, I'd say within 9 or 10 years, we will have a deep recession when we eventually come to terms with this debt. Either way, you're cooked at some point again, but it's probably 9 or 10 years off. And again, my forecast, 2000. And I think I just unmuted myself so that we're okay again. And anyway, again, if you didn't hear that, 2030 is my forecast for not being able to kick the can down the road. But until then, for the next couple of years, we're doing fine. All right, what should we be seeing now in terms of new demand silver linings? The housing market is so strong. We should be seeing more condo conversions from rentals, including the single family rentals, than we're seeing yet. Conversion from offices to condos, big box sites to multifamily, and some of the retail. So we haven't seen it yet, but I would expect to see it in the not too distant future. We're seeing more cold storage demand from biotech, online grocers, prepared foods. We're seeing more hot delivery receptacles on apartments and condos. We're seeing more data centers, that's exploding, more biotech, more micro fulfillment centers, sometimes in old retail, more ghost kitchens, more cold storage, I think I mentioned that, more EV charging, recharging. And the point is that there are silver linings, and despite the fact that we're having problems in retail, we still have other property types that are doing very well, and you can tell me what I left out. But our post-COVID world, it's going to vary by market. In general, the dense urban markets, again, LA, San Francisco, Chicago, New York City, Boston, those are the kind of markets that are going to be hit the hardest longer term. It's not so much the big city versus small, but the dense high-rise ones. The suburban markets, the smaller cities, the low-rise buildings, they're doing just fine. And it looks like they'll continue to do just fine, especially West Coast, East Coast, and South. And do you know the percentage of office buildings that are above 3 stories? People that are from big cities think that it's a huge number, but it's actually only 11%. So if you have a 3-story building, you can actually walk up without the elevator. They weren't hit that hard during the pandemic. And those suburban office markets will come back faster. So what type of work is done in each market, its economic base certainly affects how hard they were hit by COVID and how hard how well they're coming out of it right now. If you look at working from home capacity in the 30 largest metros, you see the cities here, San Jose, DC, San Francisco, hit less hard in terms of remote work capabilities. And let's look at it on a state level. If we look at the ability to work at home, it's fairly high in Washington, California, certain other cities, New York. Again, you're going to see migration away from the urban dense areas, but the region as a whole, the more education, the more higher skilled, the better off they are. And of course, we have this kind of tale of 2 cities. The 10% of the workers that have to be frontline, in-person, retail, of course, they're hit the hardest, and the other 90% are just fine. If you look at the rents away from the city centers, you do see that the suburban markets have outperformed the urban markets for the most part. The long commute markets actually are doing better than we would have expected, partly because of the fact that, the remote work and the hybrid systems that are being put in place. Now, meanwhile, those of you that are brokers working with investors, you're waiting for distress, and we haven't had that much distress yet, but The base forecast is around 100 billion. When we get done with moratoriums and eviction moratoriums, and we allow less interference in the market, the forecast for the lower tier housing market, especially that might go into single family rentals, and the multifamily that use CMBS money as opposed to the GSE money, we may have 100 billion. Now, meanwhile, we have about 150 billion that is ready to pounce on it. So later this year, we're going to see a lot of money chasing the distress. That's going to keep the prices up a little bit, make it a little bit harder to capitalize on it. Tenant resiliency is also going to matter more in the future, and the leases are going to evolve. I'm working a little bit with CCIM National on this topic. We're trying to come up with a tenant resiliency index, but we do expect that we're going to see shorter term leases, more letters of credit required by tenants, that there'll be favored industries that are considered lower risk, and we'll look harder at the financial stability of the tenant or their hybrid strategies. One factor might be how long they've been in business, a bias towards stable longer term firms, and how much capital reserve they have. And there'll be other factors as well. Let me briefly go through who's been paying their rent. Who got hit the hardest? The theaters, the fitness centers, and then you go to the other retailers, and they got hit a little bit less hard, but they're not paying their full rent on average. The hair salons. On the other hand, the delivery food places are doing just fine. Little Caesars, as an example, paid most of their rent. The banks have done just fine. The grocery stores, the drugstores have done just fine. So retail across the board does have a totally different picture. The grocery stores, drugstores doing fine, delivery food doing fine, and some of the others nailed. Discounters pay their rent. And I'm still trying to figure this out, but apparently there's a group of people in the US that don't use the internet, don't know about Amazon Prime. They still shop in the value stores, and they're doing just fine. And then we see all the retailers evolving into more hybrid strategies where they're going more online. And that's probably a permanent trend. And it probably means smaller footprints on the retail stores as well. And we do see a number of stores opening up. And I'll skip through this. And we see the C and B malls really in trouble. About 25% of them expected to close down. Switching over to office just a little bit, healthy buildings with air quality testing, they went from optional to obligatory overnight. Again, I mentioned watching the sublease trends. San Francisco leads in sublease percentage as a percentage of the vacancy. And so that means that rents will likely continue to decline there. They've also had declines in multifamily. And co-working is interesting. It's not dead, but it certainly has modified. It's a little bit less the social model that WeWork used to use. And now it's more flexible space, and it seems like it's doing okay. But it is interesting to watch firms like WeWork, which were worth 47 billion a couple of years ago, and now they're worth less than 9 billion according to their recent deal. So we've evolved there, but again, it's not dead, but it's changing. And remote work's at a crossroads. I'd love to hear your views on this. 56% of the employees say that they're more productive when working remotely. They don't have the commuting time. They can work more. 61% say they can get more done. But only 5% of the decision makers surveyed, the leadership, the CEOs, believe that remote workers are more productive. And 70% said employees in the office are more trustworthy. So we're at a crossroads, and we're going to get different strategies. As an example, JP Morgan Chase said they'll probably go into the office 3 days a week. That's a 40% decline in the space that they need. Others have said there's a satellite company based out of Southern California said they'll go in 2 days a week. That's a 60% decline. And when I've asked experts on this, they point out that leases are going to prevent downsizing too quickly. So nothing's going to happen really fast. But most would agree that we're looking at 10 to 20% downsizing in the office market. If you look at the values, the values that we've seen in the office market have not declined. Now, keep in mind that RCA, it's mostly the institutional larger properties, but the values have not really been hit yet. Now, if I would peel out certain markets, these dense urban markets, I'm sure that we would see them hit a little bit. On the other hand, people are just not selling either in some of those markets. So if we're really going to downsize 10 to 20%, we probably will see some hits in the office market, but it's going to be harder hit in the urban dense markets and less hit in the suburban markets. So some permanent office trends, we're definitely going to see a lot of hybrid strategies, office more a place to collaborate, less centralization, less urban, more suburban, more freelance, less employees that supports the co-working market, a little bit more focus on well-being, and generally less space per worker, even though we may ditch some of the open office plans temporarily and go for more individualized space. And again, if you look at values and trends at the institutional level, they're projecting out over the next 3-4 years, very little negative value effect with the exception of retail is the only one. Now, again, these are the high quality, mostly class A, B plus properties. And I think that if we go down to the B and C, we would see a little bit more value hits, especially in retail. So for all commercial real estate, more granular, more sensors for environmental concerns, sustainability concerns, more concerns on healthy air, water, and temp, integrated and automated sensors for HVAC, elevators, air quality, everything being prop tech benefited. And right now there's about 3,000 prop tech firms out there trying to serve these transitions towards healthier buildings, better security management, better access control. And some landlords are going to have more money to invest than others. Others are going to say, we're just going to open our windows. Others are going to put in the better filters right away. And so we're going to get a very different responses out of the ownership side. A lot more automated management of facilities. We're going to see more data centers, last mile, ghost kitchens. And, you know, the fact that everybody's mentioning ghost kitchens probably means that we're going to overdevelop them as we do. More medical clinics, more office, medical office. And just a couple more points on the public and private and the trends in general. These are the REIT prices compared to the net asset values. And right now, the REIT prices suggest that that real estate is a bargain if you buy it through REITs. And it could be that the values have not been adjusted by the appraisers and that the NAVs are really lower than shown. Or it could be that that it's the leading indicator of the market. But to the extent that we're seeing any negatives, it's more in the retail sector than any other sector. And industrial is doing just fine. Multifamily is going to do just fine. Office is probably the other one that's going to be hit a little bit, and hotels. So the biggest transformation, I mentioned some of the changes that we're seeing based on prop tech resources being implemented. My university just started a website called propsolutions.tech because we don't know how the industry is going to figure out what it is that we should be doing and who the vendors out there are. And if there's 3,000 vendors out there all trying to serve better access control, better facilities management, what I do know is that 80% of them are going to be gone within 3 or 4 years, 90% within 5 years. And it's going to be really difficult to know who to pick um, to help me transform my building to keep it competitive. So this is something space to watch, but I believe it's 1998 again. But instead of .coms, it's prop tech, fintech, cryptocurrency. And we're going to definitely have a bust. I just don't know when, but we're definitely going to have a bust because there's too much money, too many vendors. Everybody thinks that they can take over CoStar and RCA because they have access to public data or something like that. And of course, it's a tougher world out there than some realize. We're also seeing some trends worth watching, like tokenization, and I'd be happy to go into that if there's any interest. But I'd like to open up the remaining time to comments and discussion and just the general economy, or wherever Helen and Matt would like to take this. Hopefully I've given you a little flavor of some of the things that I see, but in general, the economy is going to be good for a little while because we're stimulating the hell out of it. Um, and then we're all going to pay for it down the road. The younger generation, like Helen, you're going to be paying for it, but I'm going to be retired. So thank you for taking that on. And why don't we open it up and let those that have questions unmute, or maybe you can feed them through our leadership here.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Miller. That was great. And I think a lot of us feel a little bit more relief as well, hearing that there is really good news in the economy. And I apologize earlier, we were trying to scramble to find that mute button to make sure that we give you this, focus to Dr. Miller. So just to open it up and let everybody knows that you are allowed to unmute yourself if you do have questions, or just simply raise your hand at the bottom. I mean, not physically if your camera's not open, but there's a raise hand button at the bottom. I do see there are two questions. Eric Grin, who's also our past president. He said construction costs are skyrocketing. How will that play out for rents and demand?
Well, it's going to be a lag effect. Of course, lumber's, increased about 120% since a year ago, which is incredible. So that's already impacting the housing market and the low-rise construction. The 4-story and under buildings are being impacted by that. I do see that correcting itself if we let the market work over time. We will bring lumber prices down. We will increase supplies. I hope the government doesn't step in. So I view this as mostly temporary, that the market will respond. But it's true that for about 6 months to a year, lumber prices will stay up there. Labor shortages, on the other hand, I don't see that changing quickly because we just don't have enough skilled people. Or people that are skilled in building. And we've been tougher on our immigration policies, but if we have the stimulation bill and we start doing infrastructure, we're going to have severe labor shortages. And that's going to, mitigate some of the benefits that we should get out of the stimulation. So unless we change our immigration policies to bring in more labor, we're going to remain having some shortages, and that's going to slow down adding more supply in areas that we should and can, especially with infrastructure being part of it. So we will have higher construction costs. Labor is going to probably be the bigger long-term or intermediate-term problem. Lumber, I see self-correcting within a year or two, as well as steel and concrete.
Well, there are, regarding construction costs, I know that there are this 3D printing for the housing, the residential side now that they are planning on rolling out. What do you think about that?
Well, modular housing and factory built housing has always been more efficient, less waste, more efficient if you're in a dense area. And they do a great job of it in Japan and in Germany, way, way beyond anything we've done in the US for years. And then you bring in 3D printing, this concrete extrusion technique. The problem is not the technology. The problem of affordable housing tends to be more the land cost on the coastal markets. And the other problem is that our building codes are not set up to inspect 3D printed houses. So the local building inspectors have to be willing to totally change how they inspect buildings. And they're used to this really primitive system where you inspect the electric before you put the drywall sheetrock on, you inspect the plumbing before you finish it out. You do it in stages, and all of a sudden you come along with 3D printing or modular building where it's a component. This is a whole wall. You know, we have to politically change the way we inspect. I mean, it's a political process to say that we're going to accept this. So it has good potential, but it doesn't really mitigate the high land cost or the building code inspection system. So I see it as a good thing, but I don't see it as a panacea of solving the housing affordability issue at all.
Absolutely, I agree. And that kind of answered Anne's your question regarding the prefab buildings. And then she also asked, what do you think of utilizing vacant commercial buildings for the homeless via a well-managed process?
Yeah, and on the last question, if you want to look at a really great modular housing company, look at Weber House in Germany. Weber House, it's Weberhaus, house spelled like German style. Great homes, less waste, but it drives the building code inspectors nuts in the U.S. On industrial for the homeless, or let's add to that hotels. I've seen some of the announcements about buying some of the buildings and seen some of the prices, and I did some calculations, and I have no problem with the government buying distressed real estate at distressed prices and using it for housing the homeless. But what I've seen doesn't look like distress very often. It looks like they're buying at fair market prices in some cases. And so that makes less sense. We are going to have distress, and they need to be patient and wait for it. And so I see nothing wrong with buying distressed real estate in general, less so industrial because there's less distress. But if we had a recession and we have distress, it's a good time to buy that up. But the government's never really timed anything like that. So it could be a good idea for distressed hotels, but unfortunately, I'm not sure I trust the government to buy them at distressed prices or to realize that some of them are in distress.
Whether it will be a well-managed process. I think that is
Right.
also a very big
Right. Yeah. So I would prefer a little bit less government interference than more personally. But if they are going to buy stuff up, I hope that they really do seek out the distressed real estate and buy there only. Yeah.
A quick question: will you be sharing your slides with us?
I can. Admittedly, they are a bit of a mishmash here, but I'd be happy to share this and some others if you would like. Sure.
Great. And Neil asked, could you take a few minutes to give an overview of tokenization of real estate? How do we make money on this coming tide?
Oh, I thought you were looking at Neil to answer that.
Oh no, he's asking the question.
Oh, okay. Okay, I thought you were saying, Neil, give us an overview. So tokenization is a combination of blockchain, and blockchain is just a way to prove that you have title or ownership to something, where you use all the computer system network to prove, who has legal rights to something. And then you think about tokenization as adding blockchain to smaller pieces. So think of crowdfunding as an example. I'm sure you've heard of firms like Realty Mogul and other CrowdStreet funding groups out there. So tokenization would be a combination of blockchain and smaller interest pieces that are small enough that they might be able to develop a secondary market. It's a little complicated because we need to continually reevaluate the value of the real estate. and have some fair market formula for how we determine what the interests are worth. And we provide that information out. And then we let the secondary market help evolve over time and exchange smaller pieces. But we haven't seen a whole lot of tokenization yet, but we've seen some crowdfunding of smaller investments, smaller real estate investments. And the idea with tokenization is we would do it on a bigger scale. Think of
Yeah.
it as an alternative to REITs that let smaller investors get in. And I do expect that we're going to see it, but will it be a new source of money? Maybe. But crowdfunding 5 years ago, we thought it was going to take over, a big source of equity funding, and it really didn't. Part of the problem was the accredited investor designation requirement. That's loosened up this last year. We now let people that meet the net worth or income requirements be accredited, or if they have a designation like a CFA or a CCIM, you'd be able to invest as a qualified investor, whether or not you met the wealth requirements. So that's opened up a little bit. But I think tokenization is something we will see slowly, but I don't see it as a major source of equity for a while.
Yeah. And then right now it seems like even though there are buyers who ask about, can I pay with my Bitcoin or whatever,
Yeah.
but sellers like, no, we're not taking it. It's just not widely acceptable yet. And Raymond also asked, many Class B and C retail and office buildings should be rehabbed. However, zoning law is a major constraint. What do you think if there is going to be relief?
Yeah, I think that the cities are going to have no choice but to support that. And yeah, and those that don't allow more flexible zoning for conversion are certainly going to lag behind, and they're going to have more housing affordability problems, as well as less economic growth, whether it's a ghost kitchen or a micro fulfillment center. A lot of the uses too have less parking required, like self-storage from an old, big box. So we have all that extra land that we can reuse. If you're old enough to remember, 2009-10, we had about 70 million square feet of retail space that became available in 2010. And I, like others, I was scratching my head saying, how long is it going to take for that to be absorbed? Well, it was amazing. The US economy absorbed it within about a year and a half. It was all gone. So if we let markets work and we let innovators come in and we let brokers figure out higher and better uses and work with clients that can convert to those uses, whether it's self-storage or ghost kitchens or micro fulfillment or multifamily, it'll take 2-3 years, and a lot of that retail will convert over to higher and better uses that are more productive if the government allows it to happen.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, at the end of the day, if the government can actually allow that to happen, I think that is what the bottleneck is at all times. A lot of companies, they have so many good ideas, but they're not able to execute it at the end.
Well, if you look at the legislation involving real estate, we are the #1 state by far, California, in terms of legislative proposals by our state government officials, politicians. And if I looked up something just like eviction moratoriums, I bet there's 50 proposals in California on how to handle eviction moratoriums, and at the city level and the state level. So California might have a little bit more of a lag than some other states. And the same thing goes for the infrastructure stimulus. Other states are going to have shovel-ready infrastructure projects that they go, boom, we'll take the money now. In California, we're going to go, boom, we'll take the money. But by the way, we have SECRA, we have a review we have to do. And the California Coastal Commission has to put in their 3 cents. And it might take 2 to 3 years to get it going. And by that time, we don't even need the stimulus. We need the infrastructure repair. So that's just the nature of California.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, actually, that's what Tom's asking as well, that do you anticipate California changing zoning laws such as CEQA to material impact the speed and feasibility of building more housing?
No. I mean, I do see more state level pressure on local cities and transportation oriented development as an example. We've seen some changes actually, you know, making density a requirement in some local markets and encouraging affordable housing. Um, and right now, there's a federal proposal that suggests that if you want all the funding for infrastructure and other things, that you have to ease up your housing regulations
Mhm.
and make it easier to build housing, more dense. Um, but, you know, I would never underestimate the power of the NIMBYs in California or elsewhere to slow things down. Um, I mean, we have our own CEQA. Think about it. Most states have the EPA and they have the Environmental Protection Acts and lots of environmental impact statements required at the federal level. And yet California, we have our own, you know, our own. And unfortunately, the political process here is a little more complicated. You can slow down just about any development with CEQA, as you guys all know. And so I think California is uh, going to have an uphill battle, but we've made a little bit of progress um,
Mm.
by some
Mm.
state pressures. But you know, I don't expect anything quickly here. And we are losing population. I mean, I didn't cover it in my slides, but you know, we are losing population to Nevada, Texas, Oregon, Washington, Arizona. And people are leaving partly because the housing costs, partly because of the high income taxes.
Sure.
So that's probably going to continue for a while. But you know, are we going to reverse it? Not necessarily. I do my surveys at the dog park, and most of the residents that have pets here in the early morning hours, they don't want more people. They're perfectly happy to see you leave. So, you know, that tells you that's the political environment. And they don't think so much about the next generation. And I say, well, where are your kids going to live?
Yeah,
Yeah, maybe that's a problem, but they're not willing to change their vote.
that's true. Well, it is 11 right now. I don't know if you have a few more minutes to answer the rest of the questions. Um, would it be okay?
Yeah, we have just a couple more minutes. Sure.
Okay. Real quick, say, any thoughts on the impact of fintech companies on financing commercial real estate?
Of which companies? FinTech?
Fintech.
Oh, well, we may see some better sources of equity coming into play and some more of the crowdsourcing kind of fintech type things. On the debt side, it might encourage more competition, you know, leaner margins, leaner fees. It theoretically should. We've seen it in residential. So in residential, these Quicken Loan kind of firms out there have created more competition and they are getting more market share. I think commercial is a lot more complicated and it will take a lot longer to see market shares by automated vendors. Another thing related to fintech and prop tech is automated valuation. And in the residential market, we are really good. I mean, the automated valuation vendors are generally as accurate or more accurate than residential appraisers on your typical property, maybe not on your unique property. And they're the experienced appraisers with help. But for commercial, we have several firms doing commercial automated valuation models from Green Street and Reese and Black Knight and others out there. But you know, that's going to have a whole lot more error because they really don't have the underlying leases, and so it's going to take a lot longer in the commercial market to do a good job there, and appraisers will still dominate that market, which slows things down. So fintech, prop tech, I do see it affecting financing, but it's going to take us probably 10 years before we have good commercial automated valuation models.
Great.
And that's one of the biggest impediments to speeding things up and doing quicker underwriting. Having said that, it is going to affect portfolios and security values because you can do quick updates on a portfolio, nail the value for a portfolio, even though you don't know, you have more error on an individual property. So The individual property, it's going to take longer for fintech to affect it, but at the portfolio level, yeah, we're going to see benefits within the next 2-3 years.
Great, thank you so much. And I know, Nancy, you have one more question, but since we went over time, I just want to say thank you, everybody, for being here. The video of this presentation is going to be posted on YouTube channel and our website in a day or two. I do want to address this one question. It's like, how do we get more women in the commercial real estate and development? I really think that, I mean, as a chapter president, I am here to encourage any women, anyone who is interested to be part of the commercial real estate or development or anything, just join us, because I want to break that barrier of entry. Is that it doesn't, this is not an industry for only certain type of people. It is truly for everyone. And I'm so grateful for our chapter, CCIM chapter, who had been very supportive of me. And I've been with the chapter for about 7 years now. And it's been wonderful and wonderful community to be together. And I really hope that we will see more women, of course, in our chapter and also in our industry as well. And lastly, I want to thank Dr. Miller for being here, and Matt, especially Matt, inviting Dr. Miller, because that was such a wonderful session. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, I just
Thanks,
wanted to
Matt.
thank you.
Thanks, Helen. And I agree with everything you said about trying to get women in. Our own university has set up scholarships just for women students interested in commercial real estate. And we're trying to add to that fund. And we are actively recruiting and doing everything we can to try to bring more women into the program. Hey, Patricia and others that I see there. There's some women leaders out there like Patricia Lynn and Carmela Ma and others from CCIM, and they help provide role models for us. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Great, as always.
Thanks, Matt.
Thank you for your time.